So hello, welcome to this very brief introductory tutorial on the delta-delta. The delta-delta. Now this particular lesson is going to be quite short. I've spent a lot of time on the second lesson, which is going to walk you through how the delta-delta is calculated and how you can interpret it. This is just an introduction to explain why you even need a delta-delta to begin with. And it all goes towards uh, identifying complicated acid-base disturbances, especially and particularly in patients who have an anion gap metabolic acidosis. This is probably one of the most common acid-base disturbances you'll find in the hospital, but it is often not accompanied or often accompanied by other acid-base disturbances. And if you're unable to identify those superimposed acid-base disturbances, you could treat the metabolic acidosis and end up with a patient who has a completely different acid-base disturbance, one that you did not expect because you weren't not able to identify the superimposed acid-base disorder. And so the way the delta came about, or the need for the delta is that we need to identify these alternative acid-base disturbances so we can execute a variety of treatments and get the patient towards normal acid-base balance rather than fluctuate from severe acidosis to alkalosis and then back to a non-anion gap acidosis again. And that's actually what the delta does. You use the delta to determine if you have a superimposed non-anion gap metabolic acidosis, or you have a metabolic alkalosis. Now you can just imagine what would happen to a patient if you correctly identified and treated an anion gap metabolic acidosis but failed to identify one of these superimposed acid-base disorders. You'd have a patient who'd go from an acidotic state quickly to an alkalotic state, which is equally as dangerous, or a patient whose acidosis would not resolve despite you executing successfully therapy to suppress the generation of organic acids, because they have a non-anion gap metabolic acidosis as well that hasn't been addressed. And so that's the main reason why you're going to use a delta-delta. Now let's clear the screen and walk through real quickly the premise behind the delta-delta. The premise is as follows. If you have an anion gap acidosis, you have organic acid, which I'm going to label as HA. The A could be a lactate, beta-hydroxybutyrate, salicylate, etc. And this organic acid is going to liberate a proton, which is why it's an acid. And here is the anion, the lactate, the beta-hydroxybutyrate, etc. And the body has to do something with this proton. It's going to take this proton and combine it with its organic buffer system. Which will eventually end up producing CO2 and H2O. And so this proton is going to combine with the protons that are already in the body from the normal day-to-day metabolic reactions, combine with bicarb, drive this reaction in this direction, hence the very, very white arrow, and force the production of CO2, which you then exhale. So, if you had a pure anion gap metabolic acidosis, nothing else was happening except an anion gap metabolic acidosis. For every one anion that you generate, you're going to have one proton generated. Excuse me, that's here. And for every one proton that you generate, you're going to have one bicarbonate eliminated. So, for every one anion that you generate, that causes you to generate one proton, which then causes you to quench or decrease 1 bicarbonate. If you looked at the change in the generation of anions and the loss of bicarbonate, that ratio would be equal to 1. And that's what the delta-delta measures. So the delta in the numerator is the change in the anion gap. The gap is going to change because you've introduced a new unmeasured anion. If you remember, anion gaps are unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations. This is the change in unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations. You've just added an unmeasured anion. That's this. The other delta is the change in bicarbonate. And you've dropped the bicarbonate by an amount that's equal to the amount that you've raised the anion gap. You look at the difference, or the change, and their ratio. That ratio should be 1, or close to it. So a pure anion gap metabolic acidosis should have a drop in the bicarb equal to the rise in the anion gap, giving you a delta-delta of 1. One last thing before we move on to a more detailed look at the delta-delta. Say you had this, where you're now liberating 2 protons for every anion. Now this is another, H2B is another organic acid like sulfuric acid, for example. And you've liberated 2 protons for every 1 anion. Those 2 protons go here and combine with HCO3 and really drive this reaction towards the formation of CO2. Let's see how this works. For every anion that you make, you have created 2 new protons, which then quench 2 bicarbonates. Or you could write this formula in this manner. For every 2 anions with a -1 charge, which equals -2, or 1 -2 charge here, they're both the same in terms of charge. So they're pretty much the same magnitude change in concentration. So when you do your delta-delta, you're going to have a drop in the bicarbonate that appears to be equal to the rise in the anion gap. Because although you have 1 mole of a -2 charged species in your anion gap, it's equivalent to having 2 moles of a -1 charged species. So the ratio can still be 1. And so this can also apply to H3C or H4D, whatever the case may be. Most of the time in the body, you have organic acids that just come in the form of HA, where they break down into A- and H+ in a 1-to-1 ratio. So that's a introduction to the delta-delta. In our next lesson, we go into more detail as to how these formulas interplay with one another and how you can interpret